All right, what's up, everybody? This is Roman Gennaro, host of the Empire Sports Talk podcast, and we are back with yet another episode as we edge ever closer to episode 100. I know I tweeted earlier this week that there was not going to be a new episode because I was a bit under the weather, and honestly, I still am. So if you're listening on audio and my voice sounds a bit rough, I apologize. Please hang with me. But because then a lot of things happened within about a two-day period, and I felt like it was too crazy of a week to not have an episode. We usually do this on a Monday evening. It is Wednesday evening as we're recording this one, so about midweek. The new week of the NFL season kicks off tomorrow, but before we get there, let's talk about some stuff that happened this week. The first thing I want to mention is I don't even think this was the most puzzling thing of the week because of what I'm going to talk about after this, but definitely the most telling thing. One of the most outspoken owners in all of sports, Jerry Jones, you've probably heard about it by now, went on his usual radio show on 105.3 The Fan in Dallas to talk about the state of the Cowboys and that kind of thing. The problem is the Cowboys had just come off a 47-9 loss to the Detroit Lions in Dallas. It was the worst loss in AT&T Stadium history. It was the worst loss for the Cowboys since Jerry Jones bought the team in 1989. So it's pretty obvious why Jerry Jones wasn't really in the mood to talk about his team's shortcomings. And as a result, his shortcomings as the owner and GM this offseason when the Cowboys didn't do much of anything to improve last year's team, which suffered a stunning and quite frankly embarrassing loss to the Packers in the playoffs. Jerry said, we're going to run it back, assuming that they were going to take the base of that team and improve it, except they didn't really improve it at all. And now here we are. The Cowboys are 3-3, so the sky is not falling technically, but with them playing in a tough division with the emergence of Washington, which before I get fully into the Dallas thing, I want to talk about the fact that somebody on our socials this week commented on the fact that I was raving about Washington and the fact that they were 4-1. Because of course now they're 4-2 after a close loss to Lamar Jackson and the Baltimore Ravens, saying, "Oh, the Commanders aren't very good. They suck." And I imagine these were fans of NFC East teams that didn't want to admit that another team was good. They said they haven't played anybody. And so you look at it, he's like, yeah, they lost their first game to Tampa Bay. They've played New York. They played Cincinnati, who's turning it around now, but they were hitting the skids then. They've played Arizona. They've played Cleveland. They've played Baltimore, and they are 4-2, losing the two better of those 6 teams. And to that I say, maybe they haven't played anybody yet. They did just play Baltimore, and they lost a close competitive game to Baltimore. But the fact of the matter is, you play who's in front of you. And in order to take the next step, great teams beat the good teams. But in order to get to being a good team, which is something Washington hasn't been for a while, so they're trying to establish a new winning culture, to be a good team, you have to beat the bad teams. And that's what Washington's doing. They're in phase 1 with a very talented young quarterback. They're in phase 1. They're beating the bad teams. They're playing competitive games against the good teams, and that's all you can ask them. They can only play who's in front of them. And looking at their schedule from here on out, for the next 4 weeks, they have Carolina, Chicago, New York, and Pittsburgh. So they very easily could come out of Week 10 at 8-2. It's very possible. And then they have Philadelphia, Dallas, and Tennessee, who the 2 divisional opponents are playing down right now. So it's conceivable that they could, at some point this season, be 11-2. Yes, the top of their schedule is a little light, and for a rookie quarterback, that's what you want. But I in no way believe I'm assuming NFC East rival commenters on our social media saying that Washington sucks, because they don't. But I just wanted to get that off my chest before I continue talking about the Cowboys. But going back to the Cowboys, Jerry Jones suffered the worst loss of his Cowboys ownership on his 82nd birthday, 47-9 to the Detroit Lions. And this is already the second time this season that Dallas has given up 40-plus points. They are 3-3 in two of those losses to New Orleans and Detroit. They gave up 40-plus points. They got outscored in those two games combined, 91-28. And they did get 2 wins against the Giants and the Steelers. They barely won those games. And they beat what we thought was going to be a really good Cleveland team, 33-17 in week 1. Turns out Cleveland's probably the worst team in the NFL, so that win is virtually meaningless. So nothing about the Cowboys' 3 wins have said, hey, look, we're for real. And then their 3 losses are extremely eye-opening. Obviously, Dak hasn't played super well in some of these games. Definitely not this last week. He only had 178 passing yards. But the blame for this is mostly falling on Jerry Jones, as he didn't really do anything in the offseason to improve the team. And now, after this loss to Detroit, it's all seemingly coming to a head, as during his usual radio show with 105.3 The Fan in Dallas, Jerry Jones got a bit contentious when the radio hosts started asking questions about the struggles that the Dallas Cowboys have had. Obviously, they are 0-3 at home. I believe that's their first 0-3 start at home since AT&T Stadium opened. And I don't have the full audio. I'm not going to play the audio. And he said a lot more than this, and we're going to get to it, but I'm just going to read you a snippet of what was said by Jerry. Once the host started to ask questions that were critical, fairly enough, of what was happening in Dallas. And Jerry Jones said, and I quote, "You really think you're going to sit here with a microphone and tell me all of the things that I've done wrong without going over the rights? Listen, we both know we're talking about a lot of great fans, a lot of great listeners, and I'm very sorry for what happened out there Sunday. I'm sick about what happened Sunday." And then he goes on to say, which is the most baffling part of all of this to me, he says, "This is not your job. Your job isn't to let me go over all the reasons that I did something and I'm sorry that I did it. That's not your job. I'll get somebody else to ask these questions. I'm not kidding. You're not going to figure out what the team is doing right or wrong. If you are, or any of the 5 or 10 like you, you need to come to the NFL meeting I'm about to go to with 32 teams here. You're geniuses." So, and he said a lot more, and we'll get to that. But this was a really bad look for Jerry, who usually is very diplomatic and is very he is the first to talk. We always know that, but he does have a tendency to say some odd things, but he usually either backs them up or clarifies them later. This was one of the more unfiltered and aggressive things we've heard Jerry say recently. And as I mentioned, the part that bothers me the most is somebody who sits here with a microphone hosting a podcast and honestly hopes to be in a similar situation that those guys at 105.3 The Fan were in, where they get to sit down and get paid to talk, have an interview with an owner of an NFL team. He said, "It's not your job to have me go over the reasons I do what I do." And then he seemingly threatens their jobs and say, "I can get somebody else to ask me these questions. I'm not kidding. If you're going to do this, whatever." That's what bothers me, because these guys on this radio show are literally doing their jobs. Their jobs are to conduct an interview with their guest, and as a sports radio station in the city of Dallas, where expectations are pretty high for all of their local teams, but especially the Dallas Cowboys, if things aren't going well, you're going to want to talk about it. And so for Jerry Jones to come and say, "You're not going to come in here and have me explain everything that I do, why I do it," that's exactly what they're supposed to do. That's exactly, they're not there to blow smoke up your butt. They're not there to make you feel all warm and fuzzy about the mediocre job you've been doing for the last several years. And for him to say, and to be on record as saying, "I can get someone else to ask me these questions," what he may have meant was, I can get somebody else to conduct this interview. And that maybe that's all he meant. But the word choice that he chose makes it sound like I came on here so that you could ask me softball questions. You could ask me questions that make me look good. And suddenly you're asking me questions that I don't approve of. And it makes it sound like Jerry himself gave the hosts a list of questions to ask him, and when they don't ask him those questions, that's when he gets frustrated. I don't think that's what happened, but he was expecting to just be able to come in there and say, "Hey, I like what we're doing. We've hit a rough spot, but I think we can figure it out." He said that for several weeks now. He's like, "I like the team we have. I think we can get it right," and they haven't gotten it right. As I said, their last 3 weeks, they barely beat the New York Giants, who, admittedly, their defense is not garbage. Their offense is. Their defense is pretty decent. They barely beat Pittsburgh, who, granted, has a decent record, but they have no offense. And they got demolished by the Detroit Lions. What we're seeing from Jerry is pure frustration. That there's a realization setting in, as I heard somebody mention this morning, that the Cowboys are much closer to a rebuild than a championship. And with Jerry Jones having just turned 82, Jerry doesn't want to see a rebuild. We don't know what time Jerry has for that, to be quite frank. But it's really not a good look to come on to a radio show, have the radio host do the job they are paid to do by their bosses, and have Jerry Jones, owner of the Cowboys, one of the richest men in sports, threaten their jobs. First of all, Jerry has no power in that situation. Jerry does not own 105.3 The Fan. A company called Odyssey does, and that's Odyssey with an A-U-D, like audio. A company called Odyssey does, that is based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, ironically enough. Jerry Jones is not a part of that ownership group. Jerry Jones is not a part of that company. Jerry Jones has no power to fire these disc jockeys. And yet he comes in there and he says, if you're not going to ask me the questions that I approve of, essentially that's what he's saying. If you're not going to ask me questions that I approve of, if you're not going to ask me questions that make me look good, then we'll have somebody else do this. And he said I'm not gonna go over the moves that I've done and why I've done them. Well, that's probably what you should do at this point. And at another point in the interview, he said I'm paraphrasing, but he said, I'm not in the habit of looking at my messes. I usually follow the successes. And what I'll say to that is, maybe generally that's a good strategy, but as far as the Cowboys are concerned, for the last few years, it's been mostly mess. So if you're not willing to look at that mess, and you're willing to foolishly see it as a success, yes, the Cowboys are making money, but in sports, you define a success as winning championships. Jerry has stated on multiple occasions that that is his main goal. So if you're not winning championships, you're not having success, which means if it's just chaos around your organization, if your star receiver is unhappy despite getting paid, if your star quarterback isn't playing particularly well, if, granted, Dallas has a lot of injuries that to some of their best defensive players, but if your defense is quite literally getting pushed around, which they were against Detroit, it's a mess. And if you're not willing to look at your messes, you're never going to correct them. Jerry Jones himself says, I don't usually look at my messes. Well, if you don't do that, you got to cut and run. And if you're not willing to look at those messes are never going to get cleaned up. And if you're only willing to look at the positives, at the successes, and you continue to believe that the Dallas Cowboys are a success, that's a delusion from which you will never escape because you're never going to be willing to admit that it's a mess. Granted, by the look on his face in the owner's box at the end of that game, maybe it's finally starting to sink in. The Cowboys do not have enough pieces to come close to competing. I don't even know if they're going to make the playoffs this year. Mike McCarthy, I think, is lucky to have his job today. They did not go in on Derrick Henry. They did not land Davante Adams. They did not land Amari Cooper. Brandon Cooks is on IR. They have no running game. Their defense is in shambles due to injury. This is not good. And so Jerry Jones then coming on the radio and blaming other people for his problems, saying, I can find somebody else to ask me these questions. I'm not going to have you sit up here with a microphone and tell me all of the things that I've done wrong without going over the rights. Okay, what are the rights? This season, paying CeeDee Lamb, paying Dak Prescott. That's it. Are you talking about the rights from 35 years ago? Are you talking about the Super Bowls in the early 90s? Okay, our parents remember those. Those are their rights. The current largest demographic of NFL viewership does not remember those rights. As far as they are concerned, there are no rights. I had a friend in elementary school who was a huge Cowboys fan, but he was born and raised in Florida. And I asked him one time, and I said, why are you... And he would always wear, at the time, it was a Roy Williams jersey, number 11, which is now Micah Parsons, but it was Roy Williams at the time. And I asked him, I said, why are you a Dallas Cowboys fan? And he would reference Emmitt Smith and Troy Aikman and those Super Bowl teams. It's like, okay, but you were 3 when they won those Super Bowls. He said, yeah, but my dad was a Cowboys fan. There it is. This friend of mine in elementary school, wherever he is now, has been waiting his whole life to celebrate his Dallas Cowboys. What are the rights that Jerry Jones wants those hosts to go over? If there were any, he would talk about them. Those hosts would talk about them. Going back to the New York game, I watched the first half of that game, and I thought that the Dallas offense looked really good in the first half. And then they did nothing in the second half. Going to the Pittsburgh game, yes, the weather was awful. But for the most part, in that game, I thought, at least for the first half, the tattered Cowboys defense looked pretty okay. But the offense didn't have a great night. Dak got the score at the end when he needed it, but they barely beat a Pittsburgh team that is not as good as their record because they have no offense. I feel like the Detroit game and the New Orleans game, where the Cowboys got outscored by a combined 91-28, is who the 2024 Dallas Cowboys are. And the Cleveland game to open the season is just indicative of how bad Cleveland is. So I think this season is over for the Dallas Cowboys despite being 3-3, and I think deep down in his bones, Jerry Jones knows it, and this was just frustration taken out on these innocent disc jockeys at 105 The Fan. I do believe that Jerry Jones has made a statement since then, apologizing and saying that he was frustrated, but I think with everything else going on in Dallas, this is just not a good look for Jerry Jones to threaten jobs that he has no power to take away because they didn't play his game. They didn't placate to an egomaniacal owner who has already gone on a rant to the media once this season about, can you do my job? No one can do my job. This is the second time this season that he has gotten defensive over the job that he's doing. If you feel the need to get defensive about the job you're doing, there's reason for criticism of the job you're doing. Maybe this was, as I said, maybe this was Jerry Jones realizing that things are going about as badly as they can and handling it the wrong way. Maybe this is the beginning of him realizing they need a rebuild. I don't know. I just, as somebody who sits behind a microphone and dreams of doing this for a living, it frustrates me to hear someone in as privileged a situation as Jerry Jones try to take it out on someone who was just doing their job. And Jerry Jones got defensive about it and got his feelings hurt about it. You're an adult, Jerry. Act like one. The most head-scratching thing of the NFL weekend came in a game against Jerry's divisional rivals, home of the Odyssey radio group that owns 105 The Fan, the Philadelphia Eagles. Nick Sirianni and the Philadelphia Eagles have been the topic of discussion for basically a calendar year now, since after starting 10-1 through Thanksgiving weekend of 2023, they have gone 4-8 since then, including the playoffs and things. Now, in the offseason, when many people were calling for Nick Sirianni's job and saying, hey, he needs to go, something's very, very wrong, I was one of the people who was defending him, saying these things happen. You hit rough spots. They still made the playoffs. He was in the Super Bowl a year ago. I was Team Sirianni because I believed that we were entering a phase of the NFL where teams were hiring coaches that seemed to be embodiments of the city in which they coached, and Nick Sirianni felt very Philadelphia to me. But then we started hearing things about that skid at the end of last season. We started hearing that Nick Sirianni and quarterback Jalen Hurts had fundamental conflicts over how to run the offense. We heard that the offensive coordinator sided with Jalen Hurts, and they would sometimes do what they wanted to do on the field. And we heard that Hurts and Sirianni didn't really speak in the offseason. And we heard all these things, and it's like, well, it's a new season. They brought back A.J. Brown. They signed him to an extension. They brought back Davante Smith. They got all the weapons. They brought in Saquon Barkley. It's going to be fine. And they won opening night in Brazil. But since then, it's been anything but fine. They lost to Atlanta when Kirk Cousins was still figuring things out in week 2. They won in New Orleans, but only managed 15 points. They lost. They got doubled up by Tampa Bay, only managed 16 points. And then after a bye, they played Cleveland, the worst team in the NFL, at home, and they only won by 4. And I would say the only reason that Nick Sirianni is employed today is because they won. If they had lost to Cleveland, if that game would have gone 5 points the other way, Nick Sirianni would be out of a job today. And yes, things weren't bad, but the reason for that is, and again, you probably heard the headline, is that he took the time during a win at home to argue with fans behind the bench who were yelling, "Fire Nick." A couple of things. One, it is never a good look to argue with fans from the sideline, whether it be a coach or a player or whoever. 2, it's Philadelphia. Are you new here? And you're not going to win that argument. Philadelphia fans are famously probably the toughest fans in sports. Some would say Boston. They're both loud. They both let you know how they feel. But I feel like Philadelphia is worse. The fan base that infamously booed Santa Claus in the 70s. The fan base that caused Philadelphia Phillies third baseman Alec Bohm to say, "I effing hate this place," in a game at home after he made an error. He said that about his own fans. Philadelphia is a brutal place to play or coach. Everybody gets it. Everybody knows that. Yeah, so one, Nick Sirianni picks a fight with the toughest fan base in sports. Then two, he goes up to the podium and he says, "Man, that doesn't feel good. Nobody likes to be booed. I wish they would cheer for us." It's Philadelphia. They barely even cheer for you when you're winning. That's why so many people were surprised when the Philadelphia fan base banded together to cheer Trey Turner out of his slump for the Phillies last year, because it was so un-Philadelphia-like. Not to disparage Philadelphia fans, but Philadelphia is a tough place to play and coach. You can't be surprised when they tell you how they feel. It's what they do. Plus, he's arguing with them during a game in which they won. The Eagles won that game, but that's not what anybody's talking about. They're talking about Nick Sirianni giving us visual proof that he's lost complete control of this team. Jalen Hurts doesn't respect him. The offensive coordinator doesn't respect him. One of the offensive linemen called the offense constipated. The team is gone. The team has moved on from Nick Sirianni. And in almost every case where a star quarterback, a franchise quarterback, and a head coach are at odds, the head coach doesn't survive. I even think back to the last time Philadelphia had a conflict. It was Doug Peterson versus Carson Wentz. And it seemed as though the Eagles sided with Doug Peterson when they cut ties with Carson Wentz, but then they ended up firing Doug Peterson at the end of the year anyway. So coaches rarely survive the quarterback-head coach feud. On top of that, outside of the quarterback, and in some cases, if you have a rookie quarterback or a journeyman quarterback, instead of the quarterback, the head coach is the figurehead of the organization. It's either the quarterback or the head coach 100% of the time. And one of those figureheads is yelling at fans from the sideline during a game when he's supposed to be coaching a team that is in shambles. It is horrific. A year ago, I was in defense of Nick Sirianni keeping his job. 1 year later, and I am never actively going to campaign for someone's job, but I think Nick Sirianni has completely lost control of the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, unlike Dallas, Philadelphia does have the talent on the roster to still somehow make the playoffs. Jalen Hurts, Dallas Goedert, A.J. Brown, Davante Smith, Saquon Barkley. The talent is there. If they can somehow duct tape this thing together until the end of the year, if they feel like they need to part with Sirianni, Kellen Moore is there. It seemed like a foregone conclusion for several years now that Kellen Moore would eventually become an NFL head coach. Maybe that time is coming very soon. Now, the offense for the Eagles has not looked great, admittedly. But sometimes the shakeup is exactly what a team needs. And from all reports, it doesn't seem like Nick Sirianni has control over the offense, the defense, the special teams, anything. His relationship with his quarterback, out the window. And much like Jerry Jones, this just seems like he reached a boiling point and handled it the worst way possible. I've spent a lot of time on the first two subjects, so let's jump into the notable trades that happened in the last couple of days. Davante Smith, it seemed inevitable, is reuniting with Aaron Rodgers and going to the New York Jets. It seems the last few years that trades in the NFL, and trades don't happen that often in the NFL. It's usually all done through free agency. They happen, but not as much as other sports. But it seems in recent years that the compensation for trades that involve star players is getting is reaching an almost disrespectful level. Like I feel like it's kind of crazy that the Jets got Davante Adams. Did I say Smith? They got Davante Adams for basically nothing. The Jets received Davante Adams for a third-round pick that could become a second. That's it. Davante Adams is not the number one receiver in the NFL anymore. But he's still very good. I do believe he's still easily a top 10, maybe a top 5 receiver in the NFL. And you get one third-round pick, maybe a second, for Davante Adams. That just seems a little bit crazy to me. The other trade, which was a little bit under the radar, because it happened around the same time as the Davante Adams trade, was the Browns traded Amari Cooper to the Buffalo Bills. The Jets and Bills just played each other on Monday night, with the Bills coming out 23-20. Both teams needed offensive assistance. Both teams got it. And this came after Amari Cooper had a social media post that said "move or rust," which was obviously a dig at whatever's happening with whatever mess is happening in Cleveland. Amari Cooper is not the receiver he once was at the beginning of his career in Oakland or when he first got to Dallas, but he's still a very good receiver. He's still a very, very good receiver. And somebody posed the question this morning, who is going to have the bigger impact? Which of these teams won the acquisition, basically? And while I think Davante Adams is the better receiver at this point in their respective careers, I would take Davante Adams over Amari Cooper at this point. I do believe Amari Cooper is going to have the bigger impact for the Buffalo Bills because Josh Allen is proving that he's playing at an MVP level. The Bills' offense has changed up from previous years, and they're using James Cook in a more run-heavy capacity, which is helping things. The Bills' weakness on offense is receivers. They lost Stephon Diggs, and Keon Coleman is doing his best, but he's a rookie. So there's no way that he could fill the shoes that Stephon Diggs left behind. So there was a pretty big hole in the receiving core. Amari Cooper can fill that hole. Amari Cooper fills one of the biggest needs the Bills have. Davante Adams, on the other hand, while he is a great receiver and while he will add offense to the New York Jets and while he will have a positive impact on the New York Jets, the Jets are not good. They fired Robert Saleh. Interim coach Jeff Ulbrich has stripped Nathaniel Hackett of all play calling duties and given them to Jeff Downing, who is the passing game coordinator and quarterbacks coach of the Jets. And yet somehow he's keeping Nathaniel Hackett in the role of offensive coordinator. This only means one thing. It's the only reason Nathaniel Hackett even is still in the building, even still has a key card to the New York Jets facilities, is to keep Aaron Rodgers happy. I don't understand why. Rodgers and Hackett have had a relationship going back to their days in Green Bay, which you can say for half the New York Jets roster at this point. And one of the reasons that Aaron Rodgers originally wanted to go to the Denver Broncos before he signed with the New York Jets was because Nathaniel Hackett was the head coach for the Broncos at the time. Then when Aaron chose the Jets and Hackett was subsequently fired from the Broncos for being just an awful head coach, Aaron insisted that they bring in Nathaniel Hackett. But the question must be asked at this point. After 2 years with the Jets, once with Aaron Rodgers, once without, it's clear that Nathaniel Hackett brings nothing to the table. And all the proof that you need is just to look back at Green Bay. Aaron Rodgers reportedly had issues with head coach Matt LaFleur and GM Brian Gutekunst in Green Bay, and so he wanted to take Nathaniel Hackett and leave. He took Nathaniel Hackett and left, and things have not been good outside of Green Bay. But back in Green Bay, where LaFleur and Gutekunst still are, things are going pretty well with another quarterback named Jordan Love. So maybe it wasn't Nathaniel Hackett that you liked. Maybe it was Matt LaFleur. But the pride and the stubbornness that we've seen exhibited by Aaron Rodgers time and time again is not willing to admit that he chose wrong. He backed the wrong horse. So, while I do think Davante Adams is a valuable piece and will help the Jets' offense, the Jets need more help than that. The Jets have issues everywhere. And in the situation where what I do have to respect about Davante Adams is that he seemingly hasn't made his career decisions based on money, which is refreshing in today's sport culture. But he wants to play with the people he knows and trusts. He wanted out of Green Bay because he couldn't get an answer from Aaron Rodgers about if he wanted to stay. Davante Adams craved stability. So his first choice when it was time to leave was to join his college teammate Derek Carr with the Oakland Raiders. Plus, as he mentioned in his goodbye letter to Raiders fans, he said as a kid from Palo Alto that grew up a Raiders fan. So it was a match made in heaven. But Davante gets there, and you immediately turn your back on his friend, the quarterback, and the reason he came. So obviously he's not going to be very happy. So when it came time for him to request a trade, there were many places that he could have requested that would have made a lot more sense. Buffalo, Kansas City, Dallas. Places that seemingly really needed a wide receiver and were much, much closer to the playoffs. Instead, his top two choices were the Jets and the New Orleans Saints. The Jets had Aaron Rodgers. The Saints had Derek Carr. Now, the reason I think that it ended up being the Jets instead of the Saints was because Derek Carr got hurt. But I even say the Saints is a better situation because even though Derek Carr got hurt, he'll be back soon. And Spencer Rattler played pretty good in that offense a week ago, even though they lost to Tampa Bay. So I do think that the Amari Cooper to the Bills is a much stronger trade for the Bills than the Davante Adams trade is going to end up for the Jets. Because I just think the Bills are in a better situation. I think that Josh Allen's playing pretty well. I think that Amari Cooper fills a hole that Buffalo very much needs to figure out. And I am interested to see how both players fit in to their new teams. Real quick, I want to touch on baseball before we get to our last thing because this is going a bit long. And as I mentioned, I am under the weather. If you're listening to this on audio, I apologize for my voice. Again, real quick MLB recap. We're down to 4 teams. In the NLCS, we have the Mets and Dodgers. In the ALCS, we have the Yankees and the Guardians. This is ironic because prior to the season, I do believe I predicted Yankees Guardians in the ALCS, and at the start of the playoffs, I predicted Yankees Padres. The Padres obviously fell to the Dodgers, but teams we expected. And then there's the Mets, who came out of nowhere halfway through the year, caught fire, and now they are. I believe they're the stronger team in the NLCS. Obviously, the Dodgers have more firepower with Betts, Freeman, and Ohtani. But I'm not betting against the Grimace Mets and Francisco Lindor right now. That series is tied at 1 game apiece. The Yankees have a 2-0 lead over the Cleveland Guardians. So it appears that we're either going to get unless the Guardians post an unbelievable comeback, which we've seen it before against the Yankees. We've seen it before. which, by the way, I cannot wait. I saw a title card this week for the brand new 2004 Boston Red Sox Netflix documentary. Cannot wait. I think it actually comes out this week. Cannot wait for that. Unless Cleveland stages a comeback, which I don't see happening, we're either going to get a Subway Series World Series, which we haven't seen since 2000, or we're going to get a Yankees-Dodgers World Series, which Major League Baseball and Rob Manfred would love. 2 MVPs against each other. Actually, I think all told it would be 5 MVPs. Betts has 1, Freeman has 1, Ohtani has multiple, Judge has multiple, and I believe Stanton has 1. So it might be, and I'd have to look this up, so don't quote me on this. If it ended up being Dodgers-Yankees, it might be the World Series with the most collective MVPs in history. Don't quote me on that, and if you happen to know the correct answer to that, let me know in the comments. That's a really interesting stat I'd love to know. But I know that Major League Baseball would love Dodgers, Yankees, for the sake of revenue and viewership and big markets and media and all that stuff, which is kind of why I'm rooting for the Subway Series, just because it's more of a David versus Goliath kind of thing, big brother, little brother. So I'm personally rooting for Subway Series because I do believe the Yankees are as good as in. But you can never assume anything in the postseason. That's why we love the playoffs in sports. But that's your recap for the Major League Baseball playoffs. We will be back probably this time next week. We will either have some closeout games to talk about or a World Series preview. Either way, can't wait. The last thing I want to talk about is a really fun story. And I've mentioned on this podcast before that I love hockey, but I don't talk about it as much on this podcast because, quite honestly, when it comes to knowledge of players and history and that kind of thing, I am a casual. I'm still finding my footing. I don't even really have a team. I just love hockey. I love to watch it, but I still don't have as much knowledge about it, about the ins and outs of, as I do other sports. So I don't talk about it as much, but sometimes things happen that I want to talk about because they're interesting. And one thing that I have to talk about is, and I love this, there was a story this week that Maple Leafs center Steven Lorenz scored his first goal for Toronto. And he was drafted in 2015, but he scored his first goal with Toronto after signing a free agent deal earlier this month with the Maple Leafs. The reason this is news, and I love it so much, and this is the kind of stuff that we love about sports, is Steven Lorenz was drafted by the Carolina Hurricanes in 2015, and has played for 4 teams. The Carolina Hurricanes, the San Jose Sharks, the Florida Panthers, and now the Toronto Maple Leafs. The reason that this is a story, the reason I want to talk about Steven Lorenz, is that Steven Lorenz is 28 years old and was born in Ontario. He's a native of Canada. And upon scoring his first goal of the season for the Toronto Maple Leafs, who, as I said, he signed with in October after winning the Stanley Cup last year as part of the Florida Panthers, his sister posted his yearbook quote from 15 years ago. So when Steven Lorenz was 13 years old in the 7th grade in Canada, and Lorenz's quote in the yearbook said, the question in the yearbook, where I'll be in 15 years. And Steven said, playing in the NHL, and in parentheses he said, with the Leafs. So this was a dream and a goal of Steven Lorenz for 15 years. And so with his first goal with the Toronto Maple Leafs, what a story. I'm so glad that his sister posted that memory so that we could it's one of those moments that you love sports, even if you're not a fan of a certain team or not a fan of a, whatever. Like I said, I'm a hockey casual. I love hockey, but I haven't reached that die-hard level yet. I really want to, but I don't really have a team that I'm super passionate about at the moment. But it's one of those moments that, just as a fan of a sport, you look at and you're like, that's pretty cool. So I just wanted to take a moment and shout out Steven Lorenz for accomplishing a lifelong goal, not just to play in the NHL, but to play in the NHL and score a goal for the very team that you've dreamed of doing that for. So congratulations to Steven Lorenz and the Toronto Maple Leafs. It sounds like you got a good one. That's all I have for you. Thank you for bearing with me as I'm still a little under the weather and congested. I appreciate the fact that you're willing to listen and to watch on YouTube. As I mentioned at the top, we are edging closer to 100 episodes. This has been a labor of love for a very, very long time. I published this week an article on EmpireSportsTalk.com talking about why I brought the blog back and why I started up an official website after I put the blog down for many years. The blog that started this all. This podcast started as a blog in 2012. And then I added the podcast in 2014, and I put the blog down, but I recently brought it back. I published an article on EmpireSportsTalk.com this week about why I brought the blog back. It's very important to me. I appreciate all of you for going along with us on this. We also just joined Reddit. For those of you that are Reddit fans, we've already, in just a few days, engaged in a lot of fun conversations and topics and things. So join our community. Join our Empire Sports Talk Pod community on Reddit and get in on some of those fun discussions. And I just enjoy getting able to talk sports with you guys. Reach out to us. Subscribe on YouTube. Click that notification bell so you get notified when there's new episodes of the podcast, new videos such as Xbox Expose and Power Rankings. And we can't wait to see you. See you on the next video.